Welcome back to the deep dive. You have reached the final and I think the most anticipated moment of our five-part journey into John Maynard Keynes's groundbreaking 1923 text, A Tract on Monetary Reform.
This is it, the grand finale.
It really is. For the past four deep dives, we've walked through the ruins of the post-war economy. We've seen the devastating human cost of all this currency instability and watched as enterprise was just paralyzed by financial risk.
That's right. If the first four chapters of the tract were a forensic and, let's be honest, often furious diagnosis, a brutal, unsparing indictment of the chaos,
Yeah.
then this final chapter, chapter 5, is the definitive prescription.
We're moving from the critique to the cure.
Exactly. To Keynes' positive suggestions for the future regulation of money.
And that diagnosis was comprehensive. Just to reground us, in our last deep dive, we saw Keynes tear down the gold standard.
Oh, completely.
He labeled it, famously, a barbarous relic, arguing that its theoretical value was just entirely gone. And then he immediately rejected the painful, misguided policy of deflation.
Right, the attempt to force domestic prices back down to those rigid pre-war gold parities.
Which, for Keynes, was not just some academic error, it was a profound social injustice.
It was. As he detailed right back in Chapter 1, that process meant the outright impoverishment of labor and enterprise. It forced honest business people to restrict production, to fire workers, just because they couldn't afford to pay off debts that were suddenly far, far heavier.
All thanks to the steady, painful appreciation of money.
And it's crucial to remember the high stakes he used to illustrate this point. The historical parallels he pulled out were, well, they were devastating.
Yes, we talked about the insurrection caused by the Roman Emperor Aurelian.
Aurelian's deflationary zeal, yes,
Yeah.
when he tried to reform the currency. The story from Gibbon, which Keynes cites, serves as this powerful warning. Aurelian's intent was good, but the immediate painful grievance of deflation, a grievance that hurt the common citizen, it caused a civil war that cost 7,000 soldiers their lives.
It just goes to show that monetary policy is not abstract. It's political dynamite.
And then there was the more immediate parallel, Ricardo, speaking in 1822. Even that champion of economic rigor concluded that, given the economic reality of the moment, a violent change in subsisting engagements.
So forcing people to honor old debts with new, more valuable money.
Precisely. He said that would be utterly inexpedient. The lesson was stark. Trying to force the economy back to the old rules after the war had fundamentally rewritten the financial landscape was not only economically suicidal, but fundamentally unjust.
You can't enforce the past.
I can't.
So this brings us to the critical pivot point of the entire tract, the final question that hangs over 1923. If the gold standard is dead, and the misguided attempt to restore it through painful deflation is poison, what is the viable alternative?
Right. Do we simply resign ourselves to monetary chaos, to that terrifying instability we saw with the hyperinflation in Germany?
The numbers there were just staggering.
They were. By June 1923, the German currency's value had fallen 2,500-fold. I mean, the money was effectively worthless. So if you reject the metal standard, does that inevitably lead to printing press lunacy?
Or, and this is the mission statement for the rest of our deep dive, can we actually build, consciously and scientifically, a stable monetary system?
And that's what we're looking at today. The blueprint for modern central banking, a framework built on active, deliberate control and achieving internal stability rather than that passive, often damaging adherence to a metal.
Okay, let's unpack this core philosophical shift because this is the prerequisite for everything else. This is where Keynes reveals the secret that the political establishment of 1923 was desperately trying to ignore.
He really pulls back the curtain.
He starts with an assertion that completely reframes the debate. In the modern world of paper currency and bank credit, there is simply no escape from a managed currency, whether we wish it or not.
This is the revolutionary heart of the tract. It is Keynes stating plainly. The emperor has no clothes. Before the war, the great myth was that money was automatic, that the system self-regulated, guided by the tides of gold flowing between nations.
Convertibility meant money was anchored to nature, not to the whim of man.
But Keynes just systematically demolishes this idea. He argues that the moment you introduce massive volumes of paper currency and sophisticated bank credit, that automatic mechanism vanishes.
And he says even if you did manage to restore convertibility into gold, that wouldn't change the fundamental reality.
No, because the reality is that the actual value, the purchasing power of gold itself, now depends entirely on the policy decisions made by a few powerful central banks, primarily the U.S. Federal Reserve.
So gold isn't an immutable standard anymore. It's just another commodity whose value is governed by a small, secretive group of bankers.
You've got it. The system is managed anyway, whether they call it that or not. The flow of gold is no longer determined by natural laws of supply and demand, but by whether the U.S. Federal Reserve decides to buy it, bury it, or release it.
It's all about policy.
All about policy. The old gold standard of the 19th century focused narrowly on the central banks maintaining the bank ratio, that proportion of gold reserves to notes issued. But as Keynes observes, the mechanical adherence meant that the global flow of gold could just play tricks with the internal price level of a country.
They were prioritizing the exchange rate, the external price, above all else.
Exactly. And as we discussed back in our first deep dive, prioritizing the exchange rate means you sacrifice the domestic cost of living.
Which leads to injustice and paralyzed production.
It sacrifices the stability of the average worker's paycheck for the convenience of international investors.
And Keynes is so consistent on this. He reminds us again that money is only important for what it will procure.
It's purchasing power. A change in its value only matters if its incidence is unequal, causing those distortions and injustices we've been talking about. He essentially states that the financial authorities are already managing the currency through their actions. They're just too cowardly or too conservative to admit it openly.
Which brings us to the crucial choice. If the automatic system is a defunct myth, and if the war proved that governments can create credit and currency far in excess of gold reserves, then the only real choice left
between managing it well or managing it badly.
Right. Keynes' revolution is just calling for competence and honesty in a system that is already being managed badly behind this veil of deference to gold.
And that's where the intellectual friction starts. Because if we accept that management is unavoidable, we immediately run into a fundamental dilemma, which Keynes lays out starkly.
The trade-off.
The trade-off. We cannot simultaneously keep our domestic prices stable and our foreign exchange rate stable if the external value of money, like gold, is itself unstable. You have to choose one anchor.
The old orthodoxy, of course, demanded the exchange rate be fixed no matter the domestic cost. But Keynes just flips that script entirely.
He does. And this is the profound policy shift. Keynes regards the stability of prices, credit, and employment as of paramount importance. He rejects sacrificing these vital internal factors for what he calls the outworn dogma of a fixed gold price.
But I have to push back here, as a conservative banker in 1923 would. Isn't this just central planning? Aren't you trading the neutrality of an inert metal, which at least operates without political bias, for the fallibility and potential corruption of a committee of men?
That is the essential question that hangs over the entire managed currency project. And Keynes would respond by pointing to historical reality.
But the gold standard wasn't neutral.
It was never neutral. It was dictated by the ebb and flow of global trade and gold production, which were often arbitrary and violent. He says that this non-metallic regulated standard had already slipped in unnoticed.
Yes, the bad fairies.
Exactly. The new system slipped in by means of the bad fairies, the wicked ministers of finance. They were forced by wartime necessity to print money and manage without the gold anchor. And Keynes turns this wartime expediency into a philosophical mandate.
He's basically saying, you already did it, you just did it unconsciously, chaotically, and in secret.
Now we must stop fearing the truth, stop hiding behind the gold mask, and start designing a system built on conscious, deliberate science.
That reframing is key. It's not an appreciation for reckless finance, but a moment of recognition. Necessity accidentally produced the academic dream of a century. The challenge is moving from accidental chaos to conscious design.
And that consciousness means identifying the goal. If the gold standard existed to stabilize the external value of money, the new managed standard exists solely to stabilize the internal value of money, to ensure the purchasing power of the shilling in a worker's pocket stays consistent.
So having established the philosophical need for this, Chapter 5 becomes the technical manual. This is where Keynes gets granular. He starts by analyzing the existing system of control in 1923.
All right, Section 1. And what he saw wasn't the Bank of England directly controlling the currency notes, but rather controlling something upstream.
The flow of credit.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He observed that the internal price level, the cost of living, is largely determined by the total amount of credit created by the commercial banks, the Big Five, as they were known.
So the Bank of England's job is to control the tap on that credit flow.
It is. And it relies on a very simple rule of thumb the commercial banks follow. They maintain a relatively fixed proportion of cash to their deposits, a conservative reserve ratio.
And their cash is mostly physical notes and, critically, their deposits at the Bank of England itself.
Yes. So by controlling the volume of that central bank money, the Bank of England indirectly determines the total volume of credit the Big Five can create. If the Bank of England restricts cash, the Big Five must restrict credit creation.
So the mechanism works through reserves, but the philosophy has completely changed.
Massively. The pre-war system focused on regulating currency, the physical notes, and hoped credit would follow. Keynes argues the modern correct philosophy is the inverse.
Regulate the creation of credit first.
Yes, using tools like the bank rate and open market operations, and then allow the supply of currency, the notes people need for daily commerce, to follow the public's actual demand. The currency is the effect, not the cause, of economic activity.
Okay, so if the primary goal is internal price stability, the Bank of England needs a lever to pull. And you mentioned that the most important positive suggestion is that the bank must regulate the price of gold, just as it already regulates the discount rate.
This is a radical redefinition of gold's role. The bank would quote a buying price and a selling price for gold. But unlike the rigid, fixed rate of the gold standard, this price would be variable.
It would change over time.
Exactly. Perhaps weekly, perhaps monthly, as required by the internal needs of the economy.
And this connects back to Irving Fisher, the American economist, and his idea of the compensated dollar.
Absolutely. Keynes is adapting that concept for sterling. The British currency would act as a compensated standard, using gold as the instrument of adjustment, not the master of the currency.
So the goal isn't to stabilize gold. The goal is to stabilize the domestic cost of living. How does regulating the gold price achieve that stability?
The goal is explicit. The bank's use of all its resources, its reserves, its power, should be primarily directed to preventing an index number of prices from moving too far from its normal level.
And that index is a carefully constructed basket of composite commodities, basically a measure of the cost of living.
That's right. So let's make that concrete. Say the price index starts creeping up, signaling domestic inflation. Cost of living is rising too fast. What does the bank do with gold?
Well, under the old rules, nothing. But under Keynes' plan,
Under Keynes' plan, if the index starts creeping up, the bank raises the price at which it buys and sells gold. This rise in the price of gold effectively makes British goods relatively more expensive abroad and foreign goods relatively cheaper at home.
so it encourages a mild deflationary pressure.
Exactly, which helps bring that commodity index back into line. And conversely, if the index falls, signaling an internal slump, the bank lowers the gold price to stimulate mild inflationary pressure.
But wait, if the bank is constantly fiddling with the price of gold to stabilize domestic prices, doesn't that fundamentally sever the connection with the global market and make the external exchange rate wildly volatile?
A crucial practical challenge. And Keynes addresses this by integrating gold into exchange management in a tactical way.
Yeah.
By setting buying and selling prices for gold that remain fixed for short periods, say a week, the bank provides a narrow band of stability.
Ah, I see. So the dollar-sterling exchange rate would stay steady within very narrow limits, maybe 1 or 2%?
Precisely. The exchange rate isn't fixed forever, but it is fixed long enough to conduct normal trade. It would only move when the bank made a considered, deliberate judgment that a change in the gold price was required for the sake of the long-term stability of sterling prices.
That is a massive shift. Monetary policy goes from being a reactive, mechanical process to a sophisticated managerial science.
And it has to be proactive. Keynes argues that waiting for an actual movement of prices in the index is, he says, too late. The damage is already done.
So the central bank needs a rule to guide its proactive intervention. This is where he brings in that famous equation from Chapter 3, right? The one relating the volume of money to the public's desire to hold cash.
Yes, let's simplify that. We're talking about how people use their money, their spending velocity. Keynes defined the volume of cash, let's call it no dollars, as being equal to the price level, 2 days, multiplied by the public's aggregate desire to hold money, which he represented as GAY plus UK.
So $1 is the cash people hold in their pockets, and $2 is their bank deposits. It's about how much purchasing power people want to keep on hand.
Right, so if the public suddenly gets nervous, they might want to hold more real balances. $2, to draw says. If the Bank of England keeps the volume of cash, The same, what happens to prices? $2.
If people hoard money, the velocity slows down. So the price level, $2 must fall. That's deflation.
And conversely, if the public decides money is a hot potato and they must spend it immediately, perhaps because they anticipate inflation, then taller and taller fall, velocity speeds up, and prices will shoot up even if the total volume of money hasn't changed.
So the central bank has to correct for these changes in public habit.
And his specific rule for action is the ultimate expression of proactive management. The time to deflate the money supply, non-$90, is when real balances are falling, when the public is rapidly spending cash, causing prices to rise too fast. You have to cool down that frenzy.
And the reverse. The time to inflate the money supply
Is when real balances are rising, when the public is hoarding money and deflation is setting in. You need to inject purchasing power to prevent prices from collapsing further. He saw this as directly correcting the mistaken policies seen during the late post-war depression.
where they were doing the exact opposite.
Tragically, yes. They were deflating the money supply precisely when real balances were already rising, which just deepened the slump.
This is truly putting the central bank in the driver's seat. They are managing human psychology and expectation, not just gold reserves.
And to cement this absolute break from the past, Keynes offers a radical reserve proposal that would have given 1923 conservative financiers heart failure.
The complete and permanent separation of the gold reserve from the note issue.
That's the one.
But wouldn't that instantly trigger a panic? How could Keynes assume the public would trust paper notes that weren't backed by the visible, rigid chain of gold reserves? That link, however fictitious, was the basis of confidence for centuries.
He argues that confidence should and must shift from the metal to the competence of the managing authority. He says gold should no longer act as a rigid automatic chain limiting the economy. Instead, gold should be treated as an immobilized asset.
A strategic, non-productive war chest.
Exactly. A reserve, but not a backing. Its sole utility would be as a purely tactical buffer, a means of rapidly correcting short-term technical fluctuations in the exchange rate.
So the Bank of England would concentrate these reserves for that narrow, surgical purpose, ready to intervene in the currency market instantly.
That's the blueprint. The volume of paper money is now determined entirely by the economic needs of the country, by trade, employment, and bank rate policy. Gold is just the tactical tool to keep the exchange rate within its narrow operating band, while the real target is the domestic price index.
It's a clean break from tradition and a profound endorsement of rational, conscious governance.
Which brings us across the Atlantic, because the United States in 1923 was the elephant in the monetary room.
Absolutely. The dollar was the de facto world standard, not necessarily because the U.S. was clever, but because they held the vast majority of the world's gold.
Indeed. And Keynes' analysis of the U.S. situation is highly critical and, frankly, quite humorous. He notes that the Federal Reserve policy, while pretending to be an automatic gold-based system, was already operating in practice as a managed currency.
How could he be so confident in saying that the Fed was officially on the gold standard?
Because the Fed had essentially demonetized gold through inaction. They were ignoring their own traditional gold reserve ratio guidelines. After the war, this massive influx of gold from Europe should have triggered a proportional and massive inflation in U.S. prices.
Right, and under the old rules, that inflation would then drive the gold back out to countries with lower prices.
But that didn't happen. The FA was actively resisting that inflation. Keynes said they were burying vast quantities of unwanted gold in Washington, literally sterilizing it, preventing it from having its full inflationary effect on prices.
They were choosing domestic stability over international metallic flows.
Yes. Keynes states plainly that the theory that the FED governs its policy by reference to the gold ratio is as dead as mutton.
That's a remarkable indictment. They were adhering to the symbol of gold while actively neutralizing its mechanism.
It's the hypocrisy Keynes sought to expose. He even points out that the Cunliffe Report in Britain, which called for a return to the gold standard, was published in 1918 without knowing about the Fed's new post-war policy of effectively burying this gold.
So the entire British conservative push to return to gold was based on a fundamental misreading of what was actually happening in the dominant U.S. market.
It was a house built on sand. And this brings us to what Keynes calls the redundant gold problem. If the U.S. held all this excess gold, why couldn't they just passively shed it through normal trade, as the old theory prescribed?
If gold was money, Europe should have been clamoring for it.
But the dynamics of global necessity had completely superseded the dynamics of monetary theory. Keynes argued it was futile to wait for the natural operation of trade to disperse America's redundant gold.
Explain the absurdity of that passive waiting game.
Well, the global economy was broken. Europe was devastated, impoverished. To trigger the outflow of gold, dollar prices would have had to rise dramatically far higher than the FED was willing to allow before America's customers would take massive quantities of what Keynes called barren metal instead of desperately needed real commodities.
I mean, think about it. Why would a German or an Englishman, starving for food and machinery, take non-productive gold from the U.S. when they could instead take wheat, steel, or tractors?
They needed substance, not symbolism. The U.S. would have had to endure a ridiculous, destabilizing inflationary boom, potentially wrecking their own economy, just to get rid of the inert gold.
So Keynes is attacking this belief, held by figures like Herbert Hoover and the big banks, that the gold would just naturally disperse.
It was a failure to apply basic market logic to the metal itself. If you have an unwanted stock of any commodity, copper, wheat, or gold, what is the logical step to get rid of it?
You reduce the price.
You reduce the price. So Keynes recommends that the logical step for the U.S. is to simply reduce the dollar price of gold.
That is a radical recommendation. Suggesting the U.S. government should deliberately cheapen gold contradicts centuries of dogma that said gold's price must be fixed.
It is. And he goes further by suggesting that the U.S. mints should eventually be closed to the compulsory acceptance of gold at a fixed price. This wouldn't immediately kill convertibility, but it would remove the obligation of the U.S. government to constantly buy unwanted gold at an expense to the taxpayer and the economy.
The ultimate policy recommendation for the U.S., therefore, mirrored his advice for Great Britain.
Yes. The U.S. should aim for the stability of the commodity value of the dollar, its purchasing power, rather than focusing on the stability of its gold value and just adjust the latter if necessary.
Okay, so if both the UK and the US are moving toward independently managed commodity standards, what does that mean for the international monetary order?
Well, Keynes emphatically rejects the idea of subordinating sterling to the dollar through a rigid gold tie. He saw that as an act of economic surrender.
Because it would effectively force the UK to sacrifice its own internal price stability to the policy decisions of the FED.
Exactly. This is a vital point about sovereignty. If the UK tied itself to a dollar whose value was managed by Washington, even managed well, the FAD's decisions on U.S. interest rates and inflation would automatically dictate UK jobs and prices. The UK would lose control of its domestic economy.
So if subordination is out, the best path forward must be collaboration.
Absolutely. The goal is collaboration. Two independently managed currencies, sterling and dollars, working together with close collaboration on aims and methods. They agree on the target internal price stability, and they agree to coordinate their policy tools.
And the genius of this vision is the inherent stability it creates. If both the US and the UK successfully manage their currencies to achieve internal stability, meaning stable employment and cost of living in both nations,
Then the stability of the dollar-sterling exchange rate follows naturally as a secondary beneficial effect.
this creates a global structure where the British Empire and parting Europe might adopt the sterling standard, a sterling bloc, while the Americas adopt the dollar standard.
And they cooperate on policy aims, and through that coordination, achieve global price stability without needing the fictional, destabilizing anchor of gold convertibility to hold them down.
It's fascinating because, looking back from today, this is precisely the architecture that the global economy moved toward over the next several decades. A world run by powerful central banks, consciously and scientifically managing money supply to optimize internal conditions.
Keynes didn't just diagnose the problem, he wrote the manual for the solution.
So we have completed the journey. We've moved from the dire consequences of monetary change, the injustice, the risk, the paralyzed production, to the concrete mechanism for stability proposed in Chapter 5.
And the conclusion represents a dramatic philosophical shift for the entire financial world.
It's the shift from passively waiting for natural causes and relying on the supposed healing powers of the long run.
The period during which, as Keynes famously lamented back in Chapter 1, we're all dead.
Exactly. From that to the conscious scientific management of money by expert central banks.
And Keynes believed that scientific management will work more efficiently and economically only when pursued consciously, deliberately, and openly. He was furious at the financial conservatives and politicians who were afraid to admit the system was already managed badly and needed explicit, intelligent design.
He demanded transparency and competence. This book, The Tract on Monetary Reform, truly laid the foundational cornerstone for modern central banking theory.
It really did. It explicitly prioritized stability of business, prices, and employment over the adherence to rigid metal standards. It was a declaration of independence from monetary policy.
Think about the depth of that philosophical change. Before the Tract, the monetary system was treated as if it were settled by a constitution, something immutable or settled by natural causes.
And Keynes repositioned it entirely. Monetary policy becomes a matter of deliberate state policy, designed specifically to eliminate one thing: the confident expectation of large price changes that paralyze production.
That confident expectation was the core economic evil. As we saw in the first deep dive, when prices are expected to rise indefinitely, the businessman turns into a reckless profiteer.
Benefiting from lucky gambling rather than true entrepreneurial skill.
And when prices are expected to fall, entrepreneurs restrict operations, leading directly to mass unemployment and slump. The core mission of the central bank, post-Tract, is to kill that expectation entirely and establish confidence in stability.
The Tract is a foundational text in the history of economic governance. It is Keynes telling the world, we have the knowledge, we have the tools, and we have the capacity to manage the economy, but we lack the political courage and the necessary institutional framework to deploy them properly.
And that leads us perfectly to our final provocative thought, something for you, our listener, to mull over as we conclude. Even as Keynes offered this elegant, seemingly flawless blueprint, he himself raised a lingering question related to human nature and governance.
A question that remains perhaps the single greatest challenge to central banks today.
Exactly. In discussing the feasibility of his system for the United States, Keynes paused his technical analysis to note that he lacked sufficient experience regarding what was the quote?
The independence of the Federal Reserve System against the farmers, for example, or other compact interests possessing political influence.
There it is. The deep, enduring question that shifts the focus from the mechanics of money to the fragility of institutions. Even with a flawless scientific blueprint for monetary management, is the governance of money ultimately vulnerable to political pressure?
Can the expert managers maintain the necessary independence to pursue the common good stable prices for everyone when powerful special interests demand inflationary or deflationary policies that benefit only them?
Keynes solved the mechanical problem. He showed how to manage the money supply to ensure stability.
But he wisely left open the political problem. The challenge shifted forever from finding the right external mechanical standard like gold to finding the right managers who possessed both the expertise and the political backbone to pursue the common good, even against the loudest voices in the political arena.
And that vulnerability is the central challenge facing every central bank governor today. An incredible conclusion to an incredible piece of work, a 100-year-old warning about the intersection of expertise and democracy.
Indeed.
Thank you for joining us on this 5-part comprehensive journey through John Maynard Keynes' A Tract on Monetary Reform. We hope this deep dive into economic history helps you explore these enduring questions about governance, stability, and the pursuit of prosperity.